internet weapon.
That was the wrong button, isn't it? Fantastic. Hey, where is it? No? Come on. There we go. All right, so we'll just start that again. Hey everyone, and welcome to this. This is a Risky Business live stream. I am Patrick Gray. These live streams are a new thing we're doing here at Risky.biz. Less structured content. This is more a live, free-flowing discussion that we're doing. We are streaming this, of course, on YouTube. And I'll probably turn this into a podcast at some point as well. But yeah, the idea is we go a little bit more in depth on a single topic rather than whipping through the week's news. And this week we are going to be talking about, along with bloody everybody else, I'm sad to say, we are going to be talking about Bluetooth contact tracing and that whole hoo-ha, because sadly there seems to be a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstandings. Just a lot of bad stuff out there, right? So we're going to try to do our best to clear it all up for you. So I'm joined by Mr. Brett Winifred, who is an editor with us at Risky.biz. Please say hello, Brett.
G'day, folks.
G'day, folks. There we go. Wonderful. And we're also joined by Tristan Luderwyk, who this is a funny one, actually, because Tristan is an old university pal of mine who happens to be an app developer with a particular expertise in Bluetooth low-energy applications. So obviously, over the last week or so, we've connected on this, and Tristan's been a very good sounding board and a very good person for me to be able to ask questions, around the specifics around this so-called GAPL proposal. Sorry, did you coin that, Brett, or did someone else coin GAPL?
I think I did GAPL, but I've since been corrected by Stilgarian that maybe Goopl gives both companies an equal share of characters.
I'm afraid he does not get to decide.
You think GAPL's better?
GAPL is there in our style guide now. So
I had some IP problems with Gwyneth Paltrow as well.
Yes, that's right. Making iPhone-scented candles and selling them under GAPL. Anyway, look, we thought it might make sense just to do this podcast to actually explain what this proposal from Apple and Google is, because a lot of people are saying, Apple and Google are engineering and developing an app, a contact tracing app. And that is absolutely not the case. A lot of people also are under a mistaken belief that governments around the world will have to choose between their own approaches to developing these apps and the Google and Apple way, which also I think is a little bit misinformed. But let's start off by going over some history here, right? I guess the one contact tracing app that most people are familiar with that kind of kicked this whole thing off was Trace Together. This is the Singapore app that was put together. Great idea. The idea is it sends out beaconing, it does beaconing via Bluetooth low energy, and everybody's beaconing to each other. And then, that will give you a sense after a while, if someone retrospectively says, yes, I was infected, you get to see if you were close to that person for a while. I mean, this was the idea behind the app. I'm going to ask you, Tristan, in just a moment to sort of talk to us about Trace Together a bit, because I know it's an app that you're familiar with. But fundamentally, the problem with that app was on iOS, it's not possible to do Bluetooth low energy beaconing in the background, right? And this kind of sunk the app. If you go and you look at the iTunes store reviews of Trace Together, it's not pretty, right? And they estimate they only got something like 17% adoption of the app. And, all in all, we can sort of consider the project, even though it was a valiant attempt and there was some good thinking that went into it, it was probably a bit of a failure. Tristan, do you agree with that assessment?
More or less. I guess you're right that the Bluetooth in the background issue for iOS is a bit of a deal breaker, really. I mean, I can't really see how that's going to work. You could look at it hypothetically and say, well, what if they just released it for Android? Would they have got a better uptake? Did the iOS implications hurt the Android users? Probably not. So anyone on an Android phone probably didn't care. But I would say that the biggest challenge to any of these projects really is convincing users to install them, because they are opt-in, which I think is a good thing. So the critical question is, how do we get people to install them? And that's going to be, there's a few elements there, but it has to work.
Before we get there, like let's just talk a little bit about Trace Together and how it works, because like even though there was some jankiness caused by its inability to get permissions to do various things in the background, it seems like they actually did a pretty good job on developing the app itself, right? Like it was just those platform limitations that kind of sunk it, but all in all, it seems like it was a very worthwhile project.
Look, I mean, by all means, it looks like the BlueTrace protocol, which is the protocol running underneath that Singapore developed. It looks like it's quite well thought out, and it is quite private and secure. It's not like like they have developed it with those kinds of things in mind. It is different to the protocol that Apple and Google have put forward, but it does look like it's a pretty well thought out protocol and a pretty well engineered piece of software, because they've also open sourced what they call the reference implementation under the name OpenTrace. So OpenTrace is an Android and iOS open source project that implement the BlueTrace protocol. And they look, like they've thought of a lot of things. There's a lot of issues they've talked about trying to work around them. But, there are some fundamental things like the fact that, the background isn't going to work on iOS unless you keep the phone open pretty much.
So, I mean, this is the way that I posit things have kind of worked out here, right? Is that Apple and Google have sort of seen this project kicking off and going, oh, okay, right. This looks like a good idea, but it's not going to work without platform support. So maybe we should look at building in some platform support. They've taken some good ideas from what they've done in Singapore, perhaps improved on them or altered them in a way that's more palatable to them, and then that's what they're going to push out as an API, right? I mean, that seems like what's happening.
Yeah, I think the Apple and Google thing is an improvement in a few ways. First of all, I'd say that Trace Together is not the only contract tracing app using Bluetooth around. There's a bunch of other things around, especially over the last few months. But the idea is not a new one. It's just one that's got a lot of momentum this year, obviously. Now, there are a bunch of other open source projects doing the same thing. There was actually a thing called FluPhone from about 10 years ago in the UK. They tried to do something similar, but not using Bluetooth. The idea is not a new one. What's different here is that Apple and Google have more control over what sort of things you can do. Like, for instance, on the iPhone, how to make it so that you can basically get past the restrictions that are put in there for privacy reasons, right? Like, it's impossible to have an iPhone sending out beacon information permanently in the background because you could use it to track the phone or something like that. So they just made that not possible. So there's no way to get around that without the accommodation that you'll get from this framework, the GAPL framework.
I mean, a lot of this was done because you didn't want advertising companies essentially being able to do really terrifyingly invasive, spooky shit, right? Like these protections are there for a reason.
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, and that highlights something that is a sideline conversation to this one, which is that there's rightly some people questioning whether we want to put this kind of tracking app on our phones. Meanwhile, we're all using Facebook and Google Maps and things like that are tracking us.
You're right. I mean, that is, I think I've alluded to it on Twitter a couple of times as well, which is everyone's worried about the privacy implications of this. But like, what is it giving authorities in this theoretical rogue health app situation? What are you giving authorities they don't already have? But look, I think it would make sense at this point, right? Because there's been so many headlines. I've seen so many headlines. Google and Apple to develop contact tracing app, right? I think a much better way to approach this in terms of explaining it is to say Google and Apple are developing platform support for contact tracing apps. They have developed a protocol that governments and health authorities can use to develop these contact tracing apps themselves. Now, let's just talk through the spec, right? Because the way this works is actually pretty interesting. What it does, right? So, okay, well, how does this work? You install an app that's been developed by your health authority onto your phone. Your phone then generates it. There's some cryptographic key material stored on your phone that generates tokens every few minutes and beacons them out. Other people who have similar apps installed or the same app installed, when they're in proximity to you, they're capturing your beacons, you're capturing their beacons. Now, if one of you turns out to be sick later on down the track with COVID-19, you go to your health authority and you say, yes, I have tested positive, or, you get your positive test. And that's all verified by a health authority. And then between the two of you, you get to sort of flag yourself as someone who's had an infection. And what that means is essentially you're uploading that cryptographic key material, not the beacons you've sent out, just the cryptographic material from your device, then goes up to the server, okay? And meanwhile, every single client out there, every single other app is constantly downloading the keys that have wound up uploaded to this server, which can then verify, cryptographically verify if any of the beacons that they've stored originated from a key that turned out to belong to an infected person. How did I go explaining that, Tristan? Sorry, Tieran is not on this call, but yeah, how did I go explaining that? That's essentially the guts of it, right?
I think so. I think there's a term you use there which is not quite correct for the Bluetrace protocol, the trace together one, which is, you said it's like doing beaconing, which means that Bluetooth is working in what they call advertising mode. So it's like a broadcast mode. So it's like a beacon. Whereas trace together doesn't use it doesn't use beaconing and advertising mode to actually do the exchange. It uses a connected mode and sends a little bit more data. So contrasting that with the Apple and Google version, which is purely advertising, just make sure that that is a
this is an important distinction, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So it is a distinction. That's going to be better for battery life. It's probably better for scalability, but otherwise, I think that you're on the right track. That's exactly how it works. What you've got is a series of not random, but cryptographically assigned numbers that change, say, every 15 minutes or so.
That appear, and this is important where you said random, and I'd get why you said that, because they appear to a passerby who might be intercepting this information to be random. You cannot take 10 beacons from 10 different points in time, and then without that cryptographic key material off the user's device, you can't then correlate that to a single device or a single person. Like, the privacy protections are pretty good.
I want to add something to that, though, and this is something that the Apple I can't say that properly in seriousness. The Google and Apple proposal, it's got an extra level of protection that you could only do as maybe the manufacturer of the OS. And what that is the fact that the cryptographic numbers that change every 15 minutes can change in sync with what they call the random Bluetooth address changing. Now, just a bit of background on that. You mentioned
so this is the MAC address. This is the MAC address randomization stuff, right?
It's like a MAC address, right? So the MAC address changes randomly, or changes every so often. Could be every day, could be every half an hour. But the client device can see that, right? So if I've got a phone and I'm scanning around me, I can see all the MAC addresses in my area, and I can see these proximity numbers, the cryptographic numbers coming from, say, trace together. Now, if I see one MAC address with one proximity tag, and then 15 minutes later you change to a new proximity tag, because I can still see the same MAC address. If you don't change both of them at the same time, there's a linkage there. So I could track you across the day as long as I'm continually tracking you until your MAC address changes. But then I see. So, MAC address across the proximity tag. So either way, it's not as strong as the Google and Apple proposal.
Absolutely. All right. So where it gets interesting. I actually didn't mean to do that, to make the window split in 3. I actually just hit the wrong button, but that's interesting. It's cool. I'm going to leave it like that. So where this gets interesting is there seems to be a bit of confusion in government circles about... So people in the Australian government, it seems to me, think that, okay, we don't want to do it this Google and Apple way, because we want to be able to actually have people's information, because the way Google and Apple have briefed media, this is a little bit their communications deficiency and a little bit the way the media's covered it. Brett and I were actually on the press call for Australian journalists about this stuff. And, I didn't think of this at the time either, but it certainly, I don't think, really came up on the call. The way that they speak about this, they talk about it being completely privacy preserving, in that, okay, say you have been in contact with someone who has later turned out positive, you can, you get an alert, and then it's up to you to go get tested. Now, I can imagine government people seeing that and going, well, no, hang on. If someone has been in close proximity to someone who's later turned out to be a confirmed case of COVID-19, we want that person's details. We want a call sheet. We want this thing shitting out a call sheet every day so that we can then go and track these people down. Now, I guess the thing to point out here is that the Google and Apple proposal is not incompatible with that, right? Because what you can do is, if you want people to give up and I think the bits of information they keep using so far are phone number and postcode. You can do that as part of the app enrollment process. Right, Tristan? I mean, there's no reason why you can't have the app that you've developed to make use of this protocol background notify the health department, you know, and shoot off the phone number and say, hey, by the way, you know, Pat Gray, you know, here's his phone number, here's his postcode, is a close contact of a confirmed case. Is there any reason you can't do that?
Presumably not. I guess the thing is, what Google and Apple released so far is a preliminary API that you can use to build one of these apps. Now, I don't know, like basically in the app, you can see the keys that are being used. Like you've got a thing like a daily tracing key, a proximity key, those kinds of things. Now, assuming that those things were exposed to the app, you could perhaps use those things outside of the Google and Apple trigger. Yeah, but it depends, like it would depend on whether or not Google and Apple actually let you see the tags that are generated, or if they're generated by the OS. So look, because this stuff's a bit preliminary.
Hang on. I don't think it even needs to do that. I mean, obviously
Really?
there's some process whereby locally your phone is making a determination about whether or not you've been a close contact. There's going to be a notification at some point. Surely when, you know, the routine that triggers that notification can also trigger a notification to your local friendly health department.
Well, the thing is, the way that the Apple and Google detection works is it runs on your phone. It doesn't run in the cloud. So that's when they say it's more decentralized. That's essentially what they're talking about. So only your phone can download the known positives and compare it with its own local database of IDs. That way, you know, I mean, this is why it is hard for the government or an authority to actually run the contact tracing themselves, because they don't have your keys. So the only way to do that would be to upload your keys when you're not a positive. Now the API that
hang on, no, I disagree. Because okay, what I'm saying is I download the app, okay? As part of the enrollment, I have to enter my postcode, my phone number, right? And then I get assigned some sort of unique ID that the government sees. Okay. Now I've coded this app so that when it does get a hit locally on the device in a privacy preserving way.
Yeah, you can do it that way.
That's kind of what I mean. That would work, right?
It would, provided you're running the app and, you know, turned your phone on that day, had the internet on.
Yeah,
so
exactly, right? So it doesn't require some central database to be correlating and cross-correlating all of these keys. You don't need them. You could just code the app so that it does the notifications for you. One of the other things that I think maybe some authorities would be looking for that maybe wouldn't be as easy or wouldn't be possible with this would be I guess if you want to have more metadata about the nature of the interaction, like I think with this kind of thing, you can probably have the proximity, like an estimation of how close you are based on the signal strength, as well as the duration of exposure based on the number of times you saw it. You could probably have those kinds of things done. But I guess, you know, if you wanted to have other metrics, that maybe the Google and Apple thing just tells you if you've had a contact or not. And, you know, maybe if you wanted to do more data analysis or overlay it with other things, which is possibly something that would be of use, right? This is something, I mean, Brett and I were talking earlier, and Brett's done a bit of research there, so I'll bring you into the conversation here, Bud, but it looks like there is going to be some sort of tunability to the alerting threshold for this app, right?
Yes, it certainly seems so for the API version. The initial operating system update, there was some degree of being able to tune those parameters. At the same time, though, you know, I get what you're saying, that a lot of health authorities would rather have immediate context rather than waiting until they hear from or get the alert from the person that's been identified as at risk due to their exposure to a COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that's because they're the two options, right? Is you wait for people to self-report after they've had a hit on their device, or you just get it to alert, you know, the health authorities, and then they've got your phone number and your postcode, and they know that you've been a close contact, and then they can start doing that context stuff like, well, okay, how much of a problem is, you know, COVID-19 where this person is reporting in from? How much do we care about the cases in this particular area? And they can prioritize accordingly.
We had an interesting discussion earlier, Pat and I, about a lot of the health authorities being worried about false positives and the fact that, you know, if the alerts are going to deemed at-risk people, deemed at-risk users before the health authority has had the chance to get on the phone to them, that they might it might cause unnecessary anxiety or panic on their part. And we talk through the utility of that information, though, because if there are false positives because of BLE signal that's gone through a wall of an office or something like that, where a person wasn't at risk, but nonetheless got the notification. And Pat raised something interesting with me, I guess, around, well, isn't that still useful? I mean, if we get the data, if the health authorities get data that helps them understand over time when the BLE signal is actually of use or not, then it's probably still something very useful to them.
And look, Tristan, I'll ask you, because you actually have a technical expertise in here. And, you know, Tristan and I studied at university together. I was doing an engineering degree. He did a double degree in engineering and computer science. And, you know, he knows a thing or two about antennas and Bluetooth and basically full stack stuff, right? Like, you know, you're good at this stuff. How easy is it to actually get a high fidelity sort of idea of distances when using BLE advertisements?
Yeah. So it's not an exact science, because it will depend on things like the antenna that's in your phone and the way it's been configured by that hardware manufacturer and things. But at the same time, there is a sort of a limit, you know, like they usually measure these things in dBm, in sort of power levels, right, in decibels kind of. Now, there'll be some variance in there of, you know, if you detect a signal at, say, minus 50 dBm, you might correctly assume it's quite close at a couple of meters, but that would depend on the model of the phone. It might be give or take plus or 5 dBm.
Well, and of course, people could be using they could be wearing their lead pants.
But yeah, but at the same time, that's not a huge range. Like,
what, nothing?
If you look at the variance in devices compared to what that would mean in free space if you're moving up and down, it's going to be a couple of meters. It's very unlikely that you get a signal strength of that through a wall, because the wall would block it, right? So maybe if you're standing right up against the wall and someone's on the other side, possibly, but even then, it's probably less likely. So I think that while there are chances of getting false positives, I think it's still quite useful. And particularly, I want to point out some work on profiling common devices that the Trace Together team did. So they've actually got some measurements where they've looked at 6 feet away or 2 meters away, what is the signal strength you'd expect from this phone in free space. So you can then have a bit of an idea and actually use that in the Trace Together app to actually improve on that. So you can say, well, if I know you're this phone, I can expect that I have to modify it by plus 4 dB to get a slightly more accurate reading. So like there's a lot of things.
We do have a comment here from W. Fenwick, which says their model, I don't know if they're talking about the Google Apple model or the Trace Together model, but their model has a low correlation score with P infection. Bluetooth minus 50 dBm is a big difference in my wet coat or in my hand. And I mean, I suppose that's a point there, right? Is that, you know, there's going to be, but look, I figure what's going to happen is there'll be some futzing, right? There's going to be some messing around with this thing to figure this stuff out, but it's not like it's never going to be useful. You know, it's always going to be useful.
I would look at some of these things in terms of compared to what, right? Compared to not having it. Is that the question, right? Is it any use at all compared to not having it? If the answer is it's just as bad or worse, then obviously it's a waste of time. But to me, a lot of the improvements here would be it's just one strategy combined with a whole lot of other ones, like self-isolation or like a whole lot of other things that we need to do. If what happens out of this is just that we figure out how to use the limited number of tests we've got to be putting them to places that are more effective, well, that's already a win. So,
well, I mean, that's it. I mean, even just getting the postcode pings, right, to tell you. Right. You know, roughly, I mean, it's going to be useful information, but I can definitely understand why health authorities want to do it that way so that the thing is actually telling them things, right? I understand that. You
wouldn't get the postcode pings unless you made the assumption that you live in this area so that your contacts were in that area. You would have no way of verifying that with either.
No, of course. But I mean, if you start getting a lot of pings from people who live in one area, you know, that's kind of
you can get right. You can make an inference, of course.
Now the question is, absolutely,
none of these things are tracking anyone's location. That's what I'm like.
No, and that's something that we should point out, right? We got people, even our former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce is all over Twitter going, you won't track me, you know, and you know, buddy, no one's interested in tracking you, and we know, you know, that you've had cause to not want to be tracked at various points in your life, and that's fine. You can continue to not be tracked. But look, a couple of interesting things here, right? First of all, Apple and Google have said they're going to make this, it's a very privacy preserving thing. I wonder how they're going to react when, say, for example, the Australian government submits its application for review in the App Store, and the first thing it does is ask for someone's phone number and their postcode, because this might not fit with the Apple perfect privacy model. It is my feeling, though, that they should allow that to go through. We're going to have to reach out to Apple and seek some guidance on that, and maybe Google as well, because they haven't really been clear about that. But
I think that
the reason, hang on, Brett, because the reason I bring that up is because I want to talk about something that you've come across, which is that Polish health authorities have tried to develop their own app, which ignores this new protocol, which isn't even out yet. So they've tried to develop their own sort of version of Trace Together. They've pushed it for App Store review, and it's basically just sitting there, and it's not being approved. That's right, isn't it?
that was for the Android app. Yep. They were pushing it out, and then they determined, the Ministry of Digital Affairs determined that they just put the app on ice until the Google Apple spec was available to them to relaunch something in mid-May. So that was interesting. It was a volunteer effort that was kind of approved by the Polish ministry. But
so it was a volunteer effort that was then submitted for review by the government, sort of thing.
Yeah, submitted by the government to the Google Store, and they had asked for an expedited review and hadn't got one back. So some of the developers have naturally inferred from that producing anything that doesn't meet spec, there might be some danger of whether or not it gets fair treatment in getting approved in either of these app stores.
They haven't actually said what the spec is, though. Do you know what I mean? Like I feel like that. There's the term that has kept coming up more in medical science around all this stuff, which is we're building the plane while we're flying it, and it feels a little bit like that in this case as well, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Google and Apple, as you say, could make people a lot more comfortable if they were very, very transparent about what they would deem to be an abuse of the API, because they're only allowing the apps to be built by central health authorities, and they don't have much of an incentive, I think, to be blocking any of those apps. I mean, they're here to make friends with governments, not lose them, I would say. And so, what's the red line? What is it that if you cross that red line, we wouldn't appreciate it? Because they've come up with a spec that's very focused on privacy.
Well, that's it. And I think it also, what they've managed to do is effectively slice themselves out from any step in the chain that involves holding personal information, which is smart, right? Because at no point are they really in the mix. And even the servers that are distributing, distributing the keys of infected people and whatever, like, they're going to be operated by the government. Apple and Google have said that, like, okay, maybe in some countries where they can't quite get their shit together to do it, they're going to stand something up for them. But they've tried to avoid being involved at all. I mean, this really is just, privacy preserving, platform support for apps. That and I guess what I like about it is you can't really take this spec and then engineer something terribly privacy destroying with it. So I think they've been quite smart about the way they've done it.
I agree, and I think that at the end of the day, they're probably going to allow a nation state that more or less plays by the rules to collect that personal information, as you said, in the app, because it's just not in their interest to be blocking that. But at least they can stand back if that health authority loses that data. If there is a security incident, Apple and Google can say, look, nothing to do with us, because the infrastructure that we set up or the spec that we produced had absolute regard for privacy and security. It was your implementation that went wrong.
Now, there was a conversation I had with Tristan earlier where he raised a really interesting point as well, which is one of the reasons that it makes total sense. And by the way, I think all three of us here are 100% kind of behind the Google and Apple way of doing this. Like, it would not make sense for a government to not go this way. it would be really fucking stupid, in fact, to try to do it another way, okay? Because it's not going to be supported. It's not going to work very well. You're going to have terrible uptake. It'll be worse than doing nothing, okay? So if there are any govies listening to this, please, for the love of all that is sensible, just wait a few weeks and do it with this spec. Now, yet another reason to do this in the way that is supported by the major platforms, and Tristan made this point to me earlier, is that, eventually we're going to want to travel again. Now, this is something that's going to be mostly useful once life has largely gone back to normal. The pandemic is suppressed to a point where life is kind of normal, and contact tracing is something that is taken very seriously. This is just one more tool to help with that. But at some point, we will need federation between different countries' servers once international travel starts again. Tristan, talk us through that concept a bit, because, that makes a lot of sense, doing it in a uniform way.
Well, really what it comes down to is that, we need to agree on some kind of standard that we use both to implement the contact tracing, like the Bluetooth communications, and the types of keys that are exchanged and what you can do with them, right? So the one thing we really need would be to see the future and know what everyone else is going to do and agree on what we're going to use, right? We need one kind of way of doing it. Now, because what's been difficult over the last month or so is, as these little things have been, like Trace Together came out in March, all these other community projects happened as well. There's even one that was launched in Australia called Contrace. Now, I don't know if it's actually in the app stores, but I think it is. It's the same thing. It's a Bluetooth contact tracing app. The problem is we've just got this fragmented world now with all these people doing independent things. And so what's really important is figuring out which one we want to consolidate on, and which one, and the one for that is probably, I would say, should be the one that requires the least amount of information, really, because then you can build.
I think also the one that's going to work. And this is the only one that's going to work.
Well, that was the second thing I was going to say. But yeah. So look, I mean, because if you look at the manifesto of Trace Together, they're saying the same thing. They're saying, oh, we've made this open source so everyone can use it, so everyone can agree this is the way to do it. But I mean, until we've got like a quorum of countries that are all saying, yes, we're using this one, it's still up in the air. Now, I would say I'd be backing the horse that has the ability to put it on all the phones that we have around, which is the second phase of Apple and Google's thing, that the proposal that they're planning on, not just doing, what they're doing now is making an API so different countries can develop apps, but in a few months' time, they'll make it part of the operating system so it's even more seamless, encouraging more people to use it, much more likely to be a world standard. So my feeling is that we should be backing that because it's going to be more future-proof.
There's an interesting parallel there with the PEP-PT work in Europe, where there was a group, or it appears to be one individual now, that was trying to bring together a bunch of European research efforts together to agree on a common approach, so that when people move across, the Schengen zone, that they'd all be taking a similar approach to contact tracing. And that's fallen apart, actually, because of half of the academics believing in a very privacy-preserving format, and the other half wanting the health authorities to have a little bit more control of their timeline and process. So now PEP-PT is kind of becoming more of almost like a lobby group for European governments to try and go to Apple and Google, when in fact, they've got the EU for that. I don't think PEP-PT really has a great deal more authority than an EU commissioner would.
It's been a policy whipsaw the last week or so, and it's amazing, because I have a feeling that the Australian government will be singing from the Google and Apple playbook by the end of the week, but let's see. Now, look, another thing I would mention too is we've got a question here from Damoskis. Hello, Damo. He's asked whether, for thoughts on whether app publishers will try to gamify or provide alternate apps to gain aggregate marketing data. Well, basically crappy publishers trying to use this thing somehow to do crappy things. And then he asks, is the API only accessible to approved, i.e. government publishers? Yes, Damo, it is only available to government health authorities. Now, whether that's federal or state is kind of up in the air. Now, I would suspect too, another thing that certainly the federal government in Australia, which has signalled, and I think this is just because they're a little bit, a little bit not up to it quite yet, right? But they've signaled that they're not going to use this Apple and Google thing because we don't want to surveil people, and that's been their line a couple of times. But yes, as I say, I suspect that's going to change. And another thing to keep in mind is that perhaps state governments might be interested in having their own Google and Apple supported tracing app, right? Considering
well, the ones that run the healthcare system. So.
Well, they're the ones that run the hospitals, right? So it's entirely possible that we might see the New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, West Australian, and it might be like that in the United States as well, if the federal government can't quite get its shit together. So that's something to keep in mind. Now we've got a couple other questions here. Andrew Harvey says, it's a comment, he says he suspects Apple will push back hard on anyone using straight up trace together, and I agree. I just think that the propeller heads at Apple and Google got together and said, look, we can do something good here, but let's crush all of the lesser attempts. I mean, that's what it feels like, right?
I think it's worth asking, Tristan, as a developer, if you've been working on something for 3 or 4 weeks and not sleeping over that period of time, maybe that announcement from Google and Apple, your reflexive reaction, I could understand it if it was negative.
Yeah.
Well, we should explain actually that this is why Tristan's involved here, is because not only does he have an expertise in this technology, but you were kind of working on an approach to this before the Apple and Google announcement, because you saw that there was certainly a potential for an approach like this to be useful. I understand you were approaching this from 2 angles. First of all, from the altruistic angle of like, maybe I can do something to help here. And second of all, because you work for a company that might have been up for a tender if the government decided to build something like this. So was that the experience though, that you guys were working away at it, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, Google and Apple just took it away?
So okay, so a few things there. First of all, there are a few different open source communities that are doing some things like this, and they're trying to do a similar thing to trace together, really. So like it really just hints at the point I was making earlier about the fact that there's a fragmented world of people trying to do different things independently. But a lot of those organizations or initiatives are still going ahead as well. And what their plan would probably be is at least launch something, test something, and then maybe try and incorporate some of the Google and Apple things for anyone who wanted to use that as well in future, right? So it's to me, it's a little bit confused, but like I imagine everyone wants to release something now, but yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say, in a few weeks' time, when the other things are available, I think that most of those people working in that area would maybe recognize that it would be worth leaning on those APIs as well, mainly because of the reliability.
I agree. I mean, I think that's the way it's going to go as well, which is people are going to be, look, I mean, one thing I want to bring in here, and this was from Brett was all over this one, which is this blog post here from Jason Bay, who I believe is
at the Singaporean government.
Yeah,
Singaporean
government, I mean, it's funny, right? Because out they come to kind of take a bit of a dump on the Google and Apple proposal. Blah, blah, blah. There could be false positives. There could be false negatives. It just read a little salty, right? I mean, there's some weird tech scene politics involved here. It feels like, to me. Anyway.
There's some accusations in that piece as well that Google and Apple haven't listened to health authorities or haven't worked with epidemiologists, which we know isn't true. They have done as much work as the Singaporeans on that. There might be some valid concerns around, hey, why should Google and Apple determine my timeline for when I release an app? I was already working on this. I was already asking for this.
But that's what I mean. It feels like saltiness, like protecting your patch. Hey, I was here before you.
And also manual contact traces are probably in the same kind of situations where they're saying, we have a process that we've agreed. We've got 300 people sitting in a room on the phones, and your app might compel us to, well, not your app, as you said, this framework might result in apps that require me to change some of my processes to accommodate the digital part of the process. And we like things the way they are, thanks very much. So it does read a little bit like that, the humans in the loop who are experts in their field, that understand the sensitivity of the information they're imparting, who have been very stressed over the last few months, there is just a reflexive human reaction to say, don't you dare come in and tell me that there's a better way to do this.
No, that makes sense. But I think there are some assumptions made in this post as well about like whether this is about slicing humans out entirely. I don't necessarily think it is. I mean, as I've been saying for most of this stream, it's my sense that, you know, the Australian government certainly wants this thing to be able to feed them a little bit of data rather than just notifying users who then get to decide what action they're going to take. But look, this leads us to the final thing I want to talk about, which is uptake. And it's really hard to get a sense of what sort of uptake we're going to see on an app like this. I believe it was something like 17% in Singapore, but the app wasn't particularly effective, particularly on iOS. So that might have had something to do with it. Also, you know, perhaps when the app first came along, people weren't necessarily taking the pandemic quite as seriously as now. I think the politics, you know, the retail politics around that have changed quite substantially. I think it's an easier sell now, which is, hey, put this app on your phone and then you can go outside and see your friends again. I think that's a nice thing to be able to do. But I mean, first of all, Tristan, what's your sense? I mean, the you know, various academic studies say between 40 and 60% of people need to install this thing for it to be useful. What's your sense on how easy it's going to be to get people to install this app?
I would say it would, you know, vary depending on the individuals, but like there's a whole spectrum of people out there who would say, hey, this is great, I'm just going to give up my privacy without knowing anything about it, saying, hey, we need to do this. And on the flip side, there's a lot of people that are saying, hell no, I wouldn't trust this no matter what you say. And so
yeah,
I think what's interesting at the moment is like conversations like the ones we're having today, which is around helping people who are in the middle, you know, figure out which side they should be on. So, you know, like if people are going to have you know, make an assumption like, well, if it comes from the government, they're tracking me, this is no good, but it actually is really well engineered and private and secure, then maybe they made a mistake by just ignoring it, you know? So the question is, how do we convince people who, you know, the large number of people who are sitting on the fence, which side of the fence they should be on?
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is it the carrot or the stick? I mean, I don't think that our government, I think our government has, by and large, and much to my surprise and pretty much everybody else's, the government has largely, it feels like to me at least, done a pretty good job in this pandemic, a better job than I expected them to do. They've been quite good, but they are not very good at charm offensives, right? They're not very good at comms. They are not going to be able to charm and woo, you know, 15 million Australians into installing an app on their phone is my feeling. So the question becomes, do we then go for some sort of pseudo compulsory thing? I mean, they've already ruled out making it compulsory, right? Now, it's my feeling that that's because I don't think legally there's a mechanism for them to force people to install apps on their phones, right? I just don't think it can be done. But I wonder if there's some sort of pseudo mandatory thing. I mean, like what they do with vaccinations, right? People start losing their family tax benefits if they don't vaccinate their kids. They can't put their kids in daycare, things like that. What do you think, Brett? I mean, could you see something like that happening, or do you think that'd backfire?
It's hard to say. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that go into it. The very interesting stat is to think about the difference between the Shield, the app that was released in Israel, and Trace Together in Singapore. Trace Together had some concern for privacy and got about, 1.5 million users. The Shield had a lot less regard for privacy. It was using GPS tracking as well as Bluetooth proximity, and it got the same number of users. So are users differentiating between something that is privacy preserving?
Hang on. Israel was one country. Where was the other one?
Sorry, Singapore
and Israel. I mean, I don't know.
They're culturally very different places.
Culturally very different, and have a different relationship with the state as well. But I mean, you guys would have been on Facebook lately, right? And seen the stupidity that we're dealing with right now. It's like this pandemic. It's like this hidden pandemic that's actually the true cost is to make everyone really dumb. Because, you know, we got people setting fire to 5G towers and stuff because they think they're implicated in COVID-19. This worries me when What's that?
There were 4G towers.
There were 4G towers that they thought were 5G towers. That's right. So, you know, the question becomes, like, in a world where dummies are setting fire to mobile phone towers because they think they cause viruses. Like, what hope do we have of getting people to install stuff? I don't know. Then again, I think the carrot here is substantial, which is, hey, chances are if you're running this app, and this might be the way to sell it, if you're running this app, you have a better shot at being tested and diagnosed earlier, which means you're going to get a better outcome.
Or you really localize the information from the app. If you are collecting postcode information in the app, as you mentioned, Pat, imagine if you could tell people as part of the public messaging, if your postcode is 90% using the app, we're going to loosen restrictions on you first. It's a pretty big carrot, I think, and that's why I believe that these apps, while they need to be federated in terms of the technology, if it can be granular enough down to in the US terminology, the county level, it really provides that incentive in a much more, concrete way. If you think about your neighborhood being open before someone else's, I don't know whether that's possible legally, but it's certainly another carrot that they could think about.
Yeah,
I think it probably would be. I mean, there's always been talk about some of these restrictions being looked at in a more tactical way based on whatever evidence we've got. So this will just be another data point that helps give you some assurance there. So
now, normally I wouldn't do this in a live setting. This is normally something that I do for the audio podcast, which is when I'm wrapping up an interview. I usually ask people, have I missed anything? Have I missed anything? Do we need to go back and ask another question? So I just thought I'd ask you, gents. I mean, do you feel like we've covered this well enough? Because I mean, the whole idea of this was to give someone who is technically minded, but perhaps not an expert, to give them a bit of a understanding of how we got here, what's at play, perhaps the path forward, because there's a lot of people in policy who tend to tune in to Risky Biz for this sort of stuff. So, I mean, have we done that? Have we left anything out?
Well, I've got a question that I don't know if anyone's got the answer to. And this is something that I think that the Prime Minister said maybe on Sunday, comparing the Google-Apple approach to the Trace Together one. And he said that the Trace Together one is a consent-based model and the Google and Apple one isn't. And I don't actually know what he meant by that, but I can't see how
But this is the thing. He's wrong. Okay?
Yeah.
He's wrong.
But I mean,
and Stuart Robert, the minister who's been talking about this as well, he is also wrong.
Yeah.
And this is why we're doing this stuff right now. Yeah, this is why the three of us are on YouTube talking about it, because we're trying to get this into the ears of some of our friends in government who can then get it on into the ears of those people. Brett, what do you feel we might have missed?
I think it's probably important for policymakers to think about what everyone else is doing. We've mentioned a couple of them, but it looks very much like, the NHS in the UK. We should mention them. They're very, very advanced. They're trialing their own home-baked solution in a few areas in Northern England. And yet we're seeing reporting out of the BBC that they're in discussions with Apple and Google. They're probably going to pivot. If the UK pivots, that's pretty big. Now, we also saw the Information Commissioner. I think you're probably thinking about bringing that one up as well. We've seen the Information Commissioner in the UK also release an opinion about whether they feel that the Google and Apple solution would meet regulatory requirements in the UK and Europe.
God damn it. See, I got distracted. I'm trying to find the goddamn tab. There it is. So this is the Information Commissioner's opinion that Brett was just talking about. I mean, just skimming it, it comes up with a,
very complimentary. And you think about the fact that they invested quite a deal of effort over the past 3 or 4 weeks in producing something, and then and now looking like they might pivot. That should probably be a cue to a few other nations. Well,
that's right. We got something here from the EU, dated 15th of April. What's this one?
This one is basically the EU trying to set a minimum standard for what they want everyone in the EU to follow. And I think in this case, it's probably not yet at the granular level we're talking about, where you might distinguish between a Google and Apple solution versus Trace Together, but it is certainly helpful that the EU is telling all of their member states, we have these minimum expectations. We think you should be using BLE for proximity. It should be consent based. There's some requirements about when you switch it off, all of that kind of thing, to create a framework that hopefully everyone follows across Europe. It's certainly very useful, I think, for all of the discrete efforts across Europe to be getting a single set of messaging. But as I said, it doesn't quite go into the level of detail that would have you determine whether or not you should be using the Google and Apple framework. And aside from pollen flipping, I mean, Czech Republic's only pushed out their app on Android. They've realized that without Google and Apple's help, there's just no point in putting out an iOS app. Denmark has said the same thing verbally. So hang
on. Let's just break it down into the simplest possible terms. You can do it this way, you can do it the Google and Apple way, or you can't really do it. I mean, not effectively. I mean, Tristan and I, we had a phone conversation earlier today, or it was the other day, where, you know, you were saying that you could maybe get some background stuff happening in iOS, but it would be janky and weird and brittle and
Well, there's different. You can't do it with advertising mode. You'd have to do it with some sort of connected mode, and, you know, those things are still being trying to be worked out. And maybe, you know, maybe our version, they've nailed it, but, you know, at the moment, it'd be tricky.
Probably
right?
just. I mean, can you think of one good reason, any good reason, not to use the Apple and Google platform support?
Not really. The main reasons I could think of is either sort of political, like we don't want to have jurisdiction, we want to be able to control this, not have someone else control it. But I see that as a feature for everyday people, that we've got more than one party involved.
So, okay, that you just said if I was a dumbass, I wouldn't like it because X. All right.
Right. And the other one would be if our health authority decided that, you know, epidemiologically speaking, we want to get more data, we want to manage this in a more hands-on kind of way, and we want to have more private information to be able to do that, and we want to be able to decide that. But I think that's also negated by the fact that the critical problem here is we need uptake, and I see, from my point of view, the fact that security experts are getting more behind the Google and Apple way, and everyone's going to sort of center around this is the way that we think it should be done if we want to have the best option of doing this, as well as the best reliability. I think that's going to give consumers the most confidence that this is the thing that they'll be able to install, and that's really.
And I think too, you can actually go halfway with this, and you can actually wind up, you know, building these apps so that they can signal health departments with PII that is used as part of the enrollment process. I mean, you can have your cake and kind of eat it too. Just before we sign it off, Brett, did you have any final thoughts about something that maybe we didn't cover here?
I wanted to ask one more question. Do you think we might see a headline in the future around an antitrust case against either of these two companies? If it is possible for iOS to allow for Bluetooth Low Energy to work in the foreground as they will allow in this spec, but they didn't allow it prior to this, is there any antitrust?
What, you reckon some
issues?
some advertising company is going to antitrust sue them for that? No, I don't.
I think more about a nation state than an advertising company, but yeah.
No, well, then it's not an antitrust thing, is it? Then it's just you're not giving us what we want thing. No, I don't see that. And I think Apple's got pretty good at fending off lawsuits about, you know, not giving up what they don't want to give up. So I don't see that as being a big thing here. But look, we're going to wrap it up because we've been going for 52 minutes here, and I promised the participants 45. So let's wrap it up. Tristan Luderwyk, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. And it was great to see you as well. It's been a little while. And Brett, thank you, of course. And I'll look forward to reading your newsletter and all of this stuff tomorrow. Goodbye, guys.
Cheers, folks. See ya.
All right. See you later.